أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. نحمد الله ونشكره ونستعينه ونستجيره ونستهديه، فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين محمد خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا رب، إنا نبتهل إليك ونتوسل إليك أن تصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا، وأن تصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا، وأن تصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا، وأن تجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير، وأن تجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر. لا إله إلا أنت. There was recently an article published in I want to make sure I get the New Yorker, an article by the journalist David Kirkpatrick that deserves to be read carefully and deserves to be reflected upon and studied. In fact, the article itself, in my opinion, is essential in any course about Islamophobia or about Muslims' race and law, or Muslims' race and society in the West. The article had appeared before under a slightly different title, but when it was first published, it got practically no attention. And as we talk about this article, it will become clear why this article got no attention. And it was reprinted under a slightly different title. Now it's called The Dirty Secrets of a Smear Campaign. I think before it was a shorter title. The article deserves a long pause because it really is the most powerful illustration, direct, unadulterated, blunt illustration of what the politics of oligarchy and despotism and dictatorship and what the politics of living colonial projects has emptied or has exhausted, spent, evacuated so much of the energy and potential in Muslim movements and Muslim institutions and Muslim causes in the West. The article is long, and I don't know how many Muslims will read it, but it deserves to be unpacked and discussed. The plan of the article is straightforward enough. It focuses on a young Muslim American, probably now in his late 30s or early 40s. This young Muslim American, Hazim Neda, is fortunate in some regards. He is the son of a very successful businessman, the son of a wealthy businessman who grew up in a world of business and a world of money. And at a very young age, Hazim Neda succeeded in creating a niche for himself in the world of oil exports. He lived in Como, Italy, and I believe continues to live in Como, Italy, I believe. But the niche, the business he created for himself, shipping oil from Libya to Korea and oil from Gabon to Italy, went quite well for him. And he became a millionaire at a very young age. And in fact, his business was dealing in figures in the billions of dollars rather than just millions of dollars. The thing about Hazim Neda is that Hazim's father, at one point in his youth, like so many Egyptians before the coup of 1952, as a way of trying to reclaim their Islamic identity and a way of opposing and protesting colonialism, like so many Egyptian youth of the 1940s and the early 1950s, Hazim's father had joined the Muslim Brotherhood and ended up, like so many Egyptian youth, paying for that by being arrested and tortured and imprisoned for a few years. However, Hazim's father, after leaving Egypt and becoming a pseudo-permanent exile from Egypt, focused on becoming a very successful businessman who became very wealthy as he immigrated to the West and the United States in particular to avoid the oppression and persecution that inevitably would be his fate back home. Hazm's father, not Hazm himself, but Hazm's father, had donated to the Muslim Brotherhood on several occasions, and especially that in countries like Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood represented the only Islamic democratic force in Egypt. The options were either an Islamic Salafi movement that considers democracy haram and considers participating in representative government haram, or the theology of the Muslim Brotherhood, which does not consider democracy haram, and in fact looked at democracy as an Islamic imperative. Anyway, Hazm's father donated to the Muslim Brotherhood on different occasions, and especially after the Arab Spring and the election of President Morsi in Egypt. Like so many Egyptians, Hazm's father enthusiastically invested in the democratic future of Egypt. Like so many Egyptians living in the West, he dreamt that Egypt would transcend the curse of post-colonial politics with its reliance on brute power and oligarchical paradigms, to lead Muslims in the Middle East as if dumb, unseeing, unhearing, unthinking cattle. The same paradigm of colonialism reproduced in the institutions of oligarchy. You Muslim masses cannot be trusted to think, cannot be trusted to choose, cannot be trusted to exercise volition. And because you cannot be trusted, you need oligarchs. You need elites that herd you and guide you like a herd of cattle, that tell you where to go, where to stop, where to eat, when to rest. And of course, as Hazm's father enthusiastically supported the democratic experiment in Egypt, it all came crashing down when the military, with the blessing of the Emirates, Saudi, Israel, and the United States, and the French government, and only God knows, these are the ones that on record, actually we have evidence of them affirmatively supporting the Egyptian coup against the short-lived democratic experiment. Okay. Now, Islamophobes had smeared Hatem's father, and their smear campaign against Hatem's father for being a part of an alleged Islamist universal conspiracy to control the world and to dominate the world and to establish a caliphate that would render all non-Muslims subservient, etc., etc., all the conspiratorial, Islamophobic, insane rhetoric. And as a result, Hazm's father was persecuted, placed on several terrorism watch lists, and had to lead a very expensive and very painful set of legal battles, including in the European Court of Justice, to clear his name and to force those engaged in a smear campaign that constantly cite him as part of a universal international Islamist conspiracy, trying through legal action to force them to stop. Now, the interesting thing is, while Hatem's father was involved in Islamic activism, or at least had donated to several Muslim Brotherhood efforts, especially in the West, and while Hatem's father had led painful legal battles to clear his name, including forcing the United States to remove him from terrorism watch list, the terrorism watch list that goes to all airports around the world, wherever he attempts to get a visa somewhere, it will be denied because the US has placed him on terrorism watch list. And after long litigation, the US, without apologies, without explanation, was forced to simply send them a short letter: "You've been removed from our terrorism watch list." No further ado. Now, so far, the big turn is suddenly not Hazm's father, but Hazm Neda himself, the son, who, it sounds like, was enjoying what sounds like a hedonistic life of making money and getting rich without cause, without purpose, without involvement. Perhaps in part, perhaps because he's seen how much his father had suffered in his life for having a cause and having a purpose. It doesn't look like Hazm Neda himself had any purpose other than marrying a beautiful Saudi woman, having children, acquiring beautiful and expensive property in Italy, renovating historical property, and all types of life indulgences. Until Hazm Neda wakes up one day to find that everything from the Wikipedia that describes his company to the Wikipedia page that describes him to all the banks that he relies on in conducting his business, to all the clients that he relies on in his oil export business, he has been everywhere blacklisted as a possible terrorism suspect. Nebulous, unclear claims of the son being somehow connected to Islamic terrorism and to Islamist conspiracies to control the world. The result was, as the article describes, is that Hazm's life turned into a living hell. Banks refused to lend him money. Banks refused to give him letters of credit. Clients refused to complete contracts with him. Various governments that he relied on to license his business and facilitate the use of their docks canceled him and informed him that he's a persona non grata, and the multi-billion-dollar business that Hazm Nada owned crumbled, and he had to declare bankruptcy and lay off hundreds of workers. And the stress of the collapse of his business even affected his relationship with his wife, which led to a divorce. The plot thickens when Hazm Nada suddenly receives a message from a hackers group, a group that specializes in hacking companies and organizations with sensitive information. And the group had hacked the business of a very dark and very suspicious fellow called Brero, with his company, or set of companies, because that's part of the smoke and mirrors, known as the Alps. Alp, which is owned, the company that Brero owns, was hacked. And the hackers group told Hazm, basically, our motivation is money. We've hacked Alp's company and Brero, and the information we have will explain to you what led to your downfall and destruction. Why suddenly you went from being everyone's best friend to suddenly a persona non grata, an untouchable person in Switzerland, in France, in Italy, in the United States. What happened to you? But they demanded millions of dollars as payment. And Hazm Nada had become bankrupt and no longer had millions of dollars to pay. But to make a rather long story short, he was allowed to see, as a way of whetting his appetite, trying to draw him in, he was allowed to see some of the information that they hacked from the Alp company owned by Brero. And therein was the real shock. Hazm Nada discovers a concerted campaign that covered every imaginable base, from changing the way that he is described in Wikipedia, the way that his company is described in Wikipedia, to resisting his efforts at fixing and correcting the misinformation that Wikipedia communicated about him, to a concerted campaign communicating to every bank he dealt with, every government, of every country he did business with, circulating unsubstantiated rumors, nothing but rumors, that Hazm Nada might possibly have ties to terrorism. Of course, the irony is it was the Alp company itself, owned by Brero, a very dark and questionable figure. The article writes about his history as well, that fabricated these rumors. They took someone who had no political activity whatsoever and absolutely destroyed his reputation. If their campaign would have led to Hazm being arrested, so be it. They didn't care. If their campaign would have led to Hazm being charged and prosecuted, they didn't care. If their campaign would have led to some crazy conclusion in the CIA that he should be among those marked for assassination by the United States, they didn't care. They cared, Brero and his Alp company cared about one thing: getting paid. And who was the client paying Brero and Alp company? The United Arab Emirates. Mohammed bin Zayed and his cronies. Now why? Well, this is the part of the article that is most intriguing. It is clear that the United Arab Emirates really had no beef with Hazm Nada and really didn't care about Hazm Nada. And in fact, before the involvement of Brero and Alp company, they didn't know much about Hazm Nada at all. Brero is not just an Islamophobic company, but it is part of an Islamophobic network of journalists and academics, including a professor at George Washington University, who deserves to be named. So in fact, although I'm blanking out on his name right now, but in fact I will name him. A devilish, immoral network of journalists and academics who specialize in smearing Muslims, specialize in Islamophobic discourses, specialize in peddling this Islamist conspiracy garbage. As the article makes clear, they don't do this simply because of their racism and their religious bigotry. but also because it is lucrative to do so. But what is fascinating about the article, as these journalists smear Islam and smear Muslims and work with companies like Alp and Barrera, who pays their bills? It's none other than the United Arab Emirates. So here is how the scheme worked. Barrera, which is his Alp company, is well aware that he can make a lot of money if he can convince the Emiratis that he is taking down Islamists. The Emiratis opened their door to Barrera to come and make a proposal. Barrera's proposal was, I can, through my smear campaigns, target Islamists. And by the expression Islamists, it turns out that Barrera meant any of the people, whether academics or businessmen, who were identified by Islamophobes as part of the Islamist conspiracy. And the Emiratis, while they pretended that they have a sophisticated intelligence system, it is clear that they did nothing beyond tell Barrera, wonderful, you take down the Islamists and we'll give you millions of dollars. Now, Barrera and his Alp company had to show results. He had to show results of lives ruined, journalists fired, academics destroyed, businessmen going bankrupt, reputations tarnished forever, so that the Emiratis can continue paying him millions of dollars. And he looked around, found the son of a man who used to belong to the Muslim Brotherhood, or maybe is still part of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not material, and said, well, his son is wealthy, it must be that, like his father, he has Islamist sympathies. He's a fair target. And what matters for Barrera and his Alps company is that he has to offer sacrifices so that the Emirati money can keep coming. It didn't matter for him at all whether this Neda fellow in any way was actually involved with anything. But what is astounding is that you discover the extent of this malignant, foul network of Islamophobes and the extent to which Muslim money keeps these Islamophobes busy and working. So you discover that it was none other than the well-known Lebanese Christian Islamophobe Roland Jacquard. Roland is a French citizen born in Lebanon who is a self-declared expert on everything Islamic. And Roland Jacquard has been one of those people who has consistently peddled the thesis of Muslims taking over Europe. But who recommended Brero to the Emiratis? It was none other than Roland Jacquard, the Islamophobe, the French Islamophobe. He played the critical role in introducing Brero and his Alp company to the Emiratis, advising the Emiratis that Brero and his Alp company are expert in destroying careers and reputations and lives. And the Emiratis received Jacquard's recommendation with great warmth and enthusiasm. August 2017, Brero arrives in the Fairmont Hotel in Abu Dhabi as a guest of the Emirati rulers. He prepared 14 pages of talking points to persuade the Emiratis to pay him to take on Qatar and its Muslim Brotherhood allies. We will aim to discredit our targets by discreetly and massively diffusing embarrassing and compromising information. The article details how the Emiratis signed a contract paying Brero millions of dollars. At one point, Brero offered to take down Tariq Ramadan, the Swiss philosopher and grandson of the movement's founder, by exposing his wild sexual life, his many young mistresses, and his lax religious practices, the article notes. Someone else beat him to it, however. 6 months after the Abu Dhabi meeting, French police charged Ramadan with sexual assault. Of course, charges that to date have never been proven. Now, the idea of targeting Nada appears to have originated in conversations with none other than Sylvain Besson, a Swiss journalist for the magazine or the journal Le Temps. Why is it important that the idea of targeted Nada came from Sylvain Besson? Because Sylvain wrote a very well-known Islamophobic book called The Conquest of the West, the Secret Project of the Islamists. This book, which became a bestseller in Europe, The Conquest of the West, the Secret Project of the Islamists, was very heavily cited by Anders Breivik in his manifesto, his 1,000-page manifesto. that he posted before he commenced his massacre of Muslims. So in other words, it is clear that Brera goes to an Islamophobic source like Sylvain Bisson and tells Sylvain, dear, since you are an expert on Muslim conspiracies, can you suggest names for us to take down and to offer to the Emiratis as sacrificial lambs so the millions can keep coming? The article then explains how a freelance writer, Nina May, an often writer who has published Islamophobic freelance pieces, but it turns out that Nina May, this freelance writer, is hired by Alps to write articles, this time focused on Neda and his purported terrorist ties. The money comes from the Emirat, but the go-between is Brera and his company, the Alps. In fact, it doesn't even stop there. The Alps company creates a fictitious freelance journalist called Tanya Klein. And Tanya Klein becomes a purported super expert in Islam and Islamists. And Tanya Klein is none other but the Alps company. And Tanya Klein commences to launch a campaign against a Muslim youth organization in Europe, a Muslim youth organization headed by Yusuf Hemmet, again compensated, that activity compensated by the Emiratis. The article goes on and on about French correspondents and journalists, British correspondents and journalists, all on the payroll, not the Emiratis directly, but the Emiratis through this go-between company that specializes in destroying Muslim lives. But as an academic, one of the most troubling pieces of in this article, or most troubling parts in this article, is that George Washington University, a while ago, hired this fellow called Vedino. I'm trying to remember his first name. Lorenzo Vedino. Yeah, that's right. Lorenzo Vedino. Lorenzo Vedino runs a program in George Washington University called Program on Extremism. Lorenzo Vedino, for years, have been in bed and in league with well-known Islamophobes like Daniel Pipes and Stephen Emerson. Far from an academic, he is nothing but a racist who constantly spins conspiracy theories about Muslims and Islamists and the danger that Muslims pose to the United States and the West in general. One often wondered how Lorenzo Vidino got his job at George Washington. Who funds this program on extremism at George Washington University? How did he pass scrutiny when his qualifications are so clearly substandard? But as this article makes clear, Lorenzo Vidino works with these Islamophobic organizations and gets paid for, in quotes, his consultancy and his expertise. And when all is said and done, the money that ends up in Lorenzo Vidino's pockets once again comes from the Emirates. Lorenzo Vidino, by the way, was among the people who was directly responsible for a far better academic and scholar, Farid Hafiz, who is responsible for the publication of the Islamophobia, European Islamophobia report. But Lorenzo Vidino was directly responsible for Austria's government targeting of Farid Hafiz and 50 other Muslims. Although, of course, after harassing and brutalizing and persecuting these Muslims, of course, no charges were brought because nothing could be proven. None of these Muslims were actually involved in anything remotely connected to terrorism. But this is just one among the many accomplishments of Lorenzo Vidino. And unfortunately, Muslims are too ignorant, too clueless, while they sit there spewing purported wisdom and supporting the likes of what's his name that had a conversation with Hamza Yusuf. What's his name? Jordan Peterson. Lorenzo Vidino has destroyed many Muslim lives and will continue to destroy many Muslim lives. All of you, I'm sure, heard of Islamic Relief. Well, Islamic Relief had to waste hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight off terrorism accusations that the likes of Barrero and Lorenzo Vidino are directly responsible for accusing Islamic Relief of being a part of a terrorism network, as they have accused every Muslim organization. And again, the payment comes from the Emirate. The article talks about British journalists like Andrew Norfolk, who wrote and continues to write for the London Times. Andrew Norfolk, a journalist with a history of inflammatory writings about Islamists and the Islamist threat to Europe. The article details how it turns out that Andrew Norfolk of the London Times is intricately interconnected with Lorenzo Vadimo, with Brero of the Alp Company, with Emirati money, which keeps and oils this machinery of Islamist conspiracy. The article details, among many examples, but one that stood out to me is a rather well-known human rights academic, Kamel Jindoubi. Kamel Jindoubi is an academic with a solid reputation in the human rights field, who has undertaken and published a number of works, mostly in French. But in 2010, Jindoubi is part of a panel that is discussing war crimes committed by the United Arab Emirates in Yemen. And Jindoubi presents a record, a shameful record that is beyond dispute. No one can seriously contest the fact that the Emirati government committed war crimes and atrocities of unimaginable proportions in Yemen. And that because of the Emirati money, they have, for the most part, simply got away with it. They have managed to call on Israel, to call on the United States, to call on Britain, to block any investigations in the International Criminal Court, to block any efforts to investigate the war crimes in the Human Rights Council, to block any efforts by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the United Nations, and to malign and slander the reputation of anyone who dared point the finger at them. Well, the article details how Jindoubi, after that conference in which he presented the evidence of the United Arab Emirates being responsible for numerous war crimes in Yemen, suddenly Jindoubi found himself a persona non grata in the academic world. No one wanted to work with him. No one wanted to invite him. No one wanted to deal with him because the Emiratis had paid people like the Alp Company, and indeed I think it was specifically the Alp Company, not like the Alp Company, to malign and slander and spread all types of unsubstantiated rumors about Jindoubi, an Islamist, although the man probably doesn't know how to recite the Fatiha. But it doesn't matter. His name sounds Arab, and you don't need the truth. Truth is an inconvenient detail. And it was easy to invent all types of slanderous stories and to completely ruin the man's reputation. I urge all of you to read this article. But pause and think. We know for certain that the Emiratis are not the only people funding Islamophobia. But this is a darn good example for why Islamophobia is lucrative. For academics, for journalists. That's point number one. But point number two, when you put together all those who are willing to spend money, not just the Emiratis, but you can add, as the article details, oligarchs from all over the Muslim world, African oligarchs, Middle Eastern oligarchs, Asian oligarchs, who want to take down opponents, want to make sure that Islam never becomes a cause of social justice. Because social justice is dangerous to them. And the trope of political Islam is very convenient at keeping the Islam of social justice and equity at bay. And whether it is the Emirati or Saudi or Israeli or Egyptian government, they are willing to pay. And ironically, they pay people who are ex-intelligence military. And the ex-intelligence are often Israelis, Americans, Russians, British, French, the colonizers of yesterday. And the colonizers milk the colonized and their financial resources to peddle a well-worn, well-known commodity. Islam is not about social justice. Islam and democracy, Islam and rights, Islam and social dignity are irreconcilable with one another. You want to be a good Muslim, don't do anything that would bother the oligarchs. Who is paying for this mission, for this message? Everyone that has an interest in keeping Islam as such. And who is it that has an interest in keeping Islam as such? Everyone who has an interest in abusing Muslims without accountability. And who is it that has an interest in abusing Muslims without accountability? Everyone, from the Russians to the dictators of the Middle East, to the Israelis, to the Americans in Iraq. They do not want an Islam that says it is part of the duty of a Muslim to seek or affirm or recognize or pursue or establish justice on this earth. Now, this reminded me This reminded me that at one point, the Emirat, when Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, rahimahullah, was alive, the Emirati newspapers started publishing a story that allegedly, reportedly, and in fact they did, somehow, they were a servant girl that had worked in Qaradawi's household was now in the Emirat being interviewed by Emirati journalists. And these news reports in the Emirat had this girl claiming that Qaradawi and his wife, who were in their 90s, forced her to watch pornographic movies with them, and then forced her to engage in threesomes. And alhamdulillah, that enough people in the Muslim world had enough sense to read these stories, shake their head, and largely ignore them. And these stories didn't have sticking power. But follow the money and see how easily it is to malign and slander, especially those who speak truth and justice and ethics and morality, especially those who find the idea of an authoritarian, despotic Islam, or an Islam that tolerates despotism and oligarchy and injustice absolutely repulsive, absolutely unacceptable. And think about how easy it is to malign and slander and defile and defame the reputation of these people. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to prove anything. All you need to do is just rumors. Maybe they're a cult. Have you thought of that? Maybe such and such is a cult. That's enough. I come back and I place the fault, the blame, directly on the individual Muslim practitioner who, as I said a million times before, decides every day of their life, do they support the scholar who is in the pockets of the Emirat, the scholar who's always silent before Israeli atrocities, the scholar who sees oppression and subordination, racial, gender, class, and is always dismissive, if not silent. These people, that type of scholar, is on the payroll. And when you choose to ignore the fact that they are on the payroll, and you choose to ignore the fact that they don't support the Islamic cause of justice and freedom and dignity, you have supported this vile reality that pervades every part of our lives. Whether you realize it or not, you are as dangerous and as morally culpable, if not more, than the Islamophobe who, out of ignorance, stupidity, or bigotry, absolutely hates Muslims. You are part, with your apathy, with your lack of moral standards and commitments, you are a part of the problem. Absolutely a part of the problem. When the Emirat and Saudi and Egypt and Israel can continue doing what they are doing, and when all is said and done, you still have a substantial number of Muslims pontificating at one point about whether Jordan Peterson is going to convert to Islam, it shows how stupid and ignorant you are as a people. And this is why people like Brera and his Alps company can look at you with the same arrogant air of superiority that colonizers always looked at, or always embraced as they looked at the colonized. The same arrogant air of superiority. These people are too stupid, too ignorant to comprehend, to care, to act, to actually take charge of their own moral fate and their own future. And so we continue playing with them like we play with children. May we wake up, inshallah, someday. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. In picking or deciding what to talk about in the second khutbah, there's so many options. But I think one issue really arose above everything else for me this week. And those who know me will probably be not surprised that it is this morally bankrupt, highly unethical, extremely alarming step or extremely alarming symptom of a Muslim corrupted soul, of having Fatih Safarjik lead Taraweeh's prayer in Times Square. This is not case of an imam with a discreet accusation of perhaps having a relationship with an employee who worked for him for a long time, in which there are discrete and complicated allegations of sexual harassment, in which, for instance, it could have been a love story that went sour, or it could have been an employment relationship that became vindictive. This is an imam with a number of young women who, at great personal risk, was lured into privacy, often because they are young and googly-eyed, with who knows why, whatever young girls are googly-eyed about. Or because they believe him when he tells them that he's going to teach them how to recite the Quran. Whatever it is. But numerous reports that when this guy gets these girls in khalwa, they are violently, sexually assaulted. In numerous complaints, including complaints filed with law enforcement, not just filed with the FACE organization, where he uses some type of rape drug to knock out these girls. Many of them were virgins. And when they spoke up about being sexually assaulted by this man, the price, the cost, in shame and embarrassment and isolation, these girls knew very well that after you speak up against a Quran reciter, because we Muslims have reached this point in our lives where we don't care about whether someone actually understands the Quran. If they recite it, oh, they're, God sent, they're a prophet. They knew very well that once they speak up, they're going to become isolated and marginalized in their own communities. They're going to be treated as pariahs. But they did it. And in fact, at least on one occasion, there is fairly well documented scientific evidence that he transmitted an STD to one of the assault victims. And knowing fully well the arrogant and dismissive way that he continued to dismiss the allegations of these girls as nothing, as if they're just insane or sexually promiscuous. None of his responses even rose to the level of an actual engagement. And then the Muslim community invites this man to lead Taraweeh prayer. Not only that, but the article notes that he has numerous invitations in Ramadan to go to many Islamic centers to lecture, to recite Quran. And I'm sure some of these mentally defective people will say, well, but how do you know that this is not part of the Islamophobic campaign to malign Islamic figures? Use your brain, you moron. What does a Quranic reciter contribute? Have you heard him talk about Israel? Have you heard him uphold Palestinian rights? Have you heard him speak out against despotism and oligarchy? Have you heard him uphold the principles of justice and liberty? These are the people that the Islamophobes fear, not someone with an attractive voice reciting the Quran. Second, if you bothered to read widely, you would know that the Islamophobes do often use what they refer to as honey traps, where they send a woman that pretends to be attracted to a male figure, obtain compromising pictures, and then blackmail that figure into silence or compliance or complacency with dictatorship. They tempt a human being who falls as a human being, but instead of bravely meeting and confronting the fact that he fell in the honey trap, as they refer to it, he goes along with the extortion because he fears people more than he fears God. But these girls, these poor women who are violently and aggressively and in the most disgusting way sexually assaulted, to simply marginalize their testimony as part of an Islamophobic conspiracy is further proof of how far we've strayed away from the Sirat al-Mustaqim and of any Muslim ethical core. I am so embarrassed, so ashamed. I wish I could apologize 1,000,000 times over to every single Muslim woman who has been hurt by this guy. And beg them to forgive us for what the truly blind amongst us has committed. I have no words. But yet again, another issue that should clearly help you separate between the unethical Islam and those who represent an unethical Islam that you should avoid and stay far away from, and those who might represent an ethical Islam, immoral Islam, that you should embrace and support. اللهم اعف عنا اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم ارحمنا اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي يا عظيم. Allah forgive our sins. Allah guide us to the straight path, the moral path, the path of moral conscientiousness, the path of justice, the path of ethics, the path of beauty, the path of your Prophet ﷺ, the path of your sirat. Allah, support us, enable us to remain strong Muslims till the day we leave this world. For the shadows and darkness that surrounds us sometimes truly feels overwhelming. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأقم الصلاة.